my name is Morena Stanley, for those of you who don't know me, lots of familiar faces in the crowd, which is always terrific. I'm the Assistant Director, Risk and Information within the TAC Secretariat, and you will know if you're an RTO with TAC that you also have a registration officer within the office, so you should know who that is if you're in that space within your provider. Now, I'd also like to welcome our online audience. So those of you that aren't aware in the room, this session is being recorded also. So I'm mic'd up and there is a camera at the back of the room. So with that said, because we have an online audience, remember if you do have a question, wait for the mic to get to you so that the online audience can also hear your question. And there may be also some questions from the online audience. So we've got some assistants at the back of the room and they will let me know when there's a question from others out there. So welcome the online audience. I want to make special mention of our three young, handsome fellows in the room, our TAFE students who are studying, what are you studying again?
Broadcast television.
Broadcast and television at TAFE. So we've got some students in the room, which is really, really terrific, which is what we're all about. So please support them and welcome the boys to the room. And so far, the support has been terrific, so thank you very much. I think that's all the intros done. I think we'll get started. At least I remembered to introduce myself. Last time I forgot to introduce myself. So, quick overview, what I'll be covering off today. Three key things: the Council's Risk Framework, a key document that the Council published last year. Its annual regulatory strategy, which there is a current version available right now, the 16-17 annual regulatory strategy. And also within that, we also talk about our education program, and the education program has had some real prominence in the space over the last 12 months, so I will make special mention of that as well. So the Council's risk approach. Now, as VET regulators, we've got the national regulator also, the Australian Skills Quality Authority, and some of you might be regulated by them, but here today I'm representing TAC and TAC's risk-based approach. At the end of the day, the VET regulators are required to have a fairly consistent approach to the way that we manage and respond to risk. So even if you are regulated by the national regulator, a lot of what I have to say is very similar and very consistent with the national regulator. So within the VET regulator standards, so as well as you having to comply with the standards for RTOs, as VET regulators, we're also required to meet our compliance requirements under the VET regulator standards. And in there is a requirement for us to have a risk-based approach that's all of those things. That's evidence-based, that's responsive, that is adaptive, and also is targeted, proportionate and timely. So even though we generally undertook our approach to regulation in this way in the past, it's much more prominent and much more we are required to let you know exactly how we manage our risk and respond to risk in a little bit more detail compared to that which we've had to in the past under the old AQTF. So since the new standards have come into play, we have been required to publish our own risk approach through our risk framework, and also let you know quite specifically the areas that we're prioritising or the areas that we want to focus on, or on behalf of the Council, Training Accreditation Council of course, and what are the likely responses to managing that risk. So insofar as our evidence base for how we arrive at what areas we're going to focus on, we've really had to do a lot of work over the last 12 months to really build a model that really has a sound evidence base. So when we say we're going to target a particular training product or we're going to target a particular area of the standards, that comes from information that we've collected over time, which is telling us or telling the Council these are our problem areas. Some of them aren't going to be any surprise to you. Assessment, for example. Earlier in the plenary session, you heard one of the ladies at the discussion panel talk about amount of training. Some of these new areas within the standards, some areas of the standards that aren't new but continue to be problematic within the sector. So our evidence base is really, really important. So we've spent a lot of time building our systems and building our systems around ensuring that we collect quality data. We also share a lot of information across VET regulators. We also share a lot of information across key industry stakeholders, like our training councils. We've got some of them in the room today. And we do speak regularly with our key stakeholders. You met Rod Cam here this morning. He facilitated the last session. We met with ACPET members recently as well. So we have very good working relationships with our key stakeholders, DCWD being another one, the Department of Training and Workforce Development. So it's really important that those meetings aren't just to catch up over coffee, that they are an exchange of really valuable information. We share information about what's coming up in each of our spaces, and we record that information and put that together with other information that we have about what's happening in the sector to ultimately come up with areas of focus. Being responsive. It's really important that we are able to, we really pride ourselves, being a state-based regulator, that we can respond to risks, particularly, and that comes into the being targeted, proportionate and timely as well, that we are able to respond to those risks in a timely manner as well. So strategic industry audits are a good example of that. So some of you that are aware of some of the more recent strategic industry audits, VET in schools, delivery, that links to the issuance of high-risk work licences in WA. Stakeholders came to us. They really pressed on the council that there were some serious issues going on, and really the council were able to look at the data that was presented to us, look at the risks that were being presented to us by those stakeholders, and agree on a strategy going forward. So, and we're able to move ahead with those quite quickly. We need to be adaptable, as you are as training providers. So it's not lost on us that we need to be able to change our strategies, shift areas of focus depending on where the risk, what the data is telling us where the risks are, and change our strategies along with that. So like I said, as you are as training providers, we ask that you're adaptable through training packages and the requirements set out in training packages and the standards for RTOs. As VET regulators, we're also asked to be flexible and adaptable depending on where the risks are and where the issues are across the sector. So, two key documents, and you'll find these on our website. I didn't bring hard copies today, but the council has published both those documents on our website at tac.wa.gov.au, and my last slide will have the website if you didn't get a chance to write that down if you're not aware. So the TAC Risk Framework is, as you would expect a framework document to be, that overarching high-level policy document which sets out the key principles of how the council manages its risks and responds to risks. So it lets you know that we have a focus on provider-specific issues. We also have a focus on looking at those systemic risks, those risks that are across the sector. It also lets you know the range of regulatory responses that might be available to the council depending on the severity of the risk. So it gives you some guidance on what to expect there. It also talks a little bit about the compliance recognition program, and there might be one or two of you in the room who are in that program. But for providers who are performing well and who've demonstrated a good audit history, then the council has a process of inviting those providers into the compliance recognition program. And it's in a way that you can amend your scope without the need to make an application or pay fees associated with that amendment application. So it is attractive to some providers, and if you're interested in having a look at that and the criteria for that, again on our website you'll see the full details there. And the TAC Risk Framework also outlines its commitment to an education program. So it's a really big shift for the council, where we've committed, or the council has committed, to work to support you better in providing more information, more workshop type activities to help improve those compliance requirements. The TAC Annual Regulatory Strategy, again, this is about the council or as VET regulators needing to be a lot more transparent. So in the TAC Annual Regulatory Strategy, and similarly with ASQA, you'll find ASQA's document on their website. That document outlines all the priorities and all the risk areas that the council has identified that need special focus or spotlight put on them. Each of those risks will let you know the regulatory response. So, and that will usually be, in all cases, proportionate to the level of risk. So it might be, the regulatory response might be audit, or the regulatory response might be an education workshop, for example, to address that issue. So there might be a number of strategies to address specific priorities or focus areas in the sector. So two key documents, and I really encourage you all to have a really close look at those, both those documents, and we're in the planning now for our 17-18 annual regulatory strategy, which the council will look to endorsing early next financial year. So the two specific, these are quite specific areas of focus for the council that it outlines within its risk framework, which are fairly obvious. Provider risks are those risks that are quite specific to the provider themselves. So the risk relates to the individual RTO. And if those risks are left unmanaged, either by the RTO or with some intervention, without some intervention from the council, then that can have serious ramifications, as you know, to the broader community. As was mentioned earlier this morning, news over the last 2 or 3 days about a fairly large provider, not a TAC provider, but going into liquidation. Some 15,000 students, I think, affected by that closure. And most of those issues linked to the vet fee help debacle. So we're really looking to ensure that we can identify those issues early so that students aren't left really with dire consequences as a result of those situations. So we really like to, at a TAC level, at a WA level, we really like to work, hence our caseload officer or registration officer approach, where you've got direct access to the Training Accreditation Council. Please let us know if there's significant changes going on at your RTO, so that we know that you're on top of any of those issues, and we can work with you if you are coming up to close your doors, or you're thinking about changing the direction of your business. Then we can just help give you some options and help guide you through some of those changes, so that students aren't disadvantaged through those significant changes. It's really important, I'm sure, to you as well as us and the wider community. And it is also about the provider risk issues and the systemic risk issues. Are about protecting the reputation of VET more broadly. There's no end of damage done when you hear about those providers that do go into liquidation, they close their doors, and the impact on those high numbers of students has far-reaching ramifications for the sector and the community. So the sooner we can get onto those issues and avoid them, the better. Systemic risk, of course, I'm not saying anything that you wouldn't be already aware of, but those risks are those risks that we see from the data. So obviously a big part of the data that we have is provider-specific data. So when we pull that data together, we actually start to see some trends that are happening across the sector. So like I said, the issues around assessment, there might be issues specifically around particular training products, or there might be issues that are affecting the sector as a whole. So, as I said earlier, we'll have sectors of the community come to us, particularly industry or other government agencies that are telling us, look, there's some systemic issues happening here that potentially we need to think about an appropriate regulatory response to help manage that situation. So, as I said, the data that we have access to is from quite a broad range. So, one of the easiest pieces of data for us to capture is your compliance history. So obviously all of your audit data is something that we have easy access to, and we already have our systems that collect that data and the relevant reports that come out of that data as well to let us know where the problem areas are. So within the risk framework document, we let you know that these are all the data sources that we're collecting to help inform risk and also the appropriate regulatory responses. So compliance history is at the top of the list because it's the one that we have easiest access to. So your audit data. Complaints history, substantiated complaints, and also even though other complaints data we hold doesn't necessarily impact on the risk profile of an RTO, for example, but we do look at general data that's coming in about what people are complaining about. But of course only substantiated complaints, so they are complaints, if you weren't already aware, that go to audit and there are non-compliances. So a complaint is only substantiated against your RTO if it goes to audit and there are non-compliances. If it goes to audit, a complaints audit, and there are no non-compliances at the main audit, then the complaint is not substantiated and doesn't affect your risk profile. So audit data, so complaints data, substantiated complaints data is an important piece of evidence for us. As I said earlier, engagement with industry. So really important focus. The Training Accreditation Council does have an industry engagement framework, and really industry engagement, I report on it quarterly to the council. It's a really important focus for us and the council. Basically, as you know, the VET sector is built on industry need. It's very much industry driven, training packages, etc., etc. So the work of the VET regulator is no different. The standards for RTOs, for example, very much industry driven. The VET regulators didn't write the standards for RTOs. We provided input into the process as you did, but we weren't the authors of them. So it certainly is an industry driven sector, as you all know. So it goes without saying that we have an industry engagement focus on the work that we do. So information that we're collecting from our industry stakeholders is a very important intelligence gathering tool for us. Training product risk. So we match data, we cross, I'm not a data person, I'm not using the right words, but we cross-check all of our data to see what trends are coming up. Non-compliance against training products across the sector, information that industry stakeholders are telling us that there's a particular issue. It might be data coming from the Department of Training and Workforce Development through their procurement activities that's telling us that there's some particular training product risk issues out there. An example of where we focus specifically on training product risk is where we've undertaken strategic industry audits at a TAC level, but not as high profile, which you may not have heard about. We might do a series of monitoring audits around a particular training product. One we did last year was around the units of competency linked to tilt-up work. There were some, unfortunately, some terrible fatalities last year. The Training Accreditation Council decided we weren't going to wait for a WorkSafe report on the outcome of that. So the council agreed to have a look at the training and assessment activity around those units. So we undertook 8 monitoring audits, 8 RTOs obviously, and we just wanted to have a little look at that level. So they're the kinds of strategies sometimes that we'll deploy from time to time. Just lower profile, just targeting specific training products from time to time. As I said, regulatory and assurance activities, so through the annual regulatory strategy, the Council will publish and you'll know what the focus areas are, and that is a live document. So even though the Council will publish its annual regulatory strategy on an annual basis, there'll be other strategies that will be introduced from time to time, which will add to the document as well. Total VET activity to a lesser degree at this stage, because it is data that's not, you know, that's 12 months old by the time it's useful to us. So we're looking at exploring better ways of utilising that data. And of course, information that comes to us through the news. Obviously, a lot of that is not substantiated, but if there's enough of it and we do our own investigations and we discover that actually is quite an issue there that we really can't avoid, then we'll put something together to the Council and have them consider whether the issue warrants some attention. Obviously, vet fee help is an example of an issue that has had high rates of interest in the newspapers, etc., etc. So it's one we've had an eye on. Luckily for WA, we've not had the extent of the issues that the Eastern Seaboard has seen. So less issues, but we do keep an eye on what's happening in our media as well. Provider risk specifically, as I said, we do look at the specific characteristics of your RTO. Your overall level of compliance, your overall history of compliance, including our systems have the capability to look at those recurring areas of non-compliance as well, and they're interesting and they help inform the systemic issues, and then that leads to looking at, well, other than audit, what are some other strategies we can help to improve compliance rates in the sector? Like, for example, introducing some education workshops in that space. We've got some webinars and other professional development opportunities as well there as quite a legitimate regulatory response tool to help address non-compliance in the sector. At a provider-specific level, any sanctions, we also look at sanctions that have been imposed by TAC, the Training Accreditation Council. So if you've had a suspension on your registration, or the Council has placed some condition on your registration, then that, of course, I mean, that it's fairly common sense, I hope you would agree, would raise the risk level of your provider. So I'm sure that goes without saying that you would be on our high watch alert, I suppose, and you could expect some increased monitoring in that space. Substantiated complaints as well. If there are a number of substantiated complaints against your RTO, remember I said substantiated complaints being those complaints that go to audit and there are non-compliances is a substantiated complaint. Multiple sites. So if you're a provider with more than one delivery site, then that could be an indicator of not necessarily negative consequences, but it's just an area, you know, we're looking to ensure that there's consistency across that delivery, depending on the cohorts that you're delivering to as well. So it just raises the radar just a little bit. Modes of delivery, of course, some attract more attention than others. VET in schools was particularly an area that was under the spotlight a couple of years ago, and continues to be, by the way. So, and linked to that is the delivery involving third-party arrangements as well. So third-party arrangements, if any of you are aware or familiar with the current annual regulatory strategy, third-party arrangements is a particularly high-risk area that we've seen come up through the data, and also linked to VET in schools arrangements is where it first started to raise an issue. And of course, in the standards, there are quite specific clauses around third-party arrangements and some definitions in the standards. So if you are outsourcing, whether it's delivery or any other service, that's something that we like to keep a close eye on as well. And there's significant changes to your RTO operations, and as I said earlier, that can sometimes mean potentially high turnover of staff. Maybe you've had a number of CEOs go through the organisation. So some of those things just spark our interest a little bit more. As I said earlier, the systemic risk issues are going to generally come from, in the most part, from the data that we're collecting from a provider perspective. So obviously compliance data that we have from the audits that we're undertaking, the compliance data that's showing up any trends across training products or industry sectors more broadly, changes to training products. One example is, for some of you might be familiar, the unit of competency linked to the white card, so work safely in the construction industry. That's recently undergone some significant changes in the assessment requirements. So examples like that, we monitor what's happening across training packages, even though with that unit the outcome it remains equivalent, we know that there's significant changes within the unit. So it's just one that we have on the radar and we just like to have a closer look at. Impacts of state and national VET policy and program changes, VET fee help again being an example that we can all relate to as being an example of that. And also changes in the labour market and their impact on VET delivery. That to a lesser extent here for WA, and depends on what's happening. Particularly the new Labor government has made some announcements about some, as Minister Ellery was sharing this morning, a number of new projects which will see some growth in job opportunities in some of those areas. So through that, we're looking at what are the upcoming training opportunities that are going to come from that. Where do we see are going to be the increases in training opportunities for that, and increases in enrolments, etc., etc. So areas to watch coming up in the future. Telecommunications being the rollout of the NBN, all those sorts of things. We look at what's coming out in the media, the data that's coming out from the state's Department of Training and Workforce Development, priority occupations, all of those sorts of things, and that's where the data all comes together to let us know where are the particular areas we need to keep our focus. So again, in our broad risk framework document, we let you know the types of regulatory responses that the council might consider. And as I said, those regulatory responses are proportionate to the provider's performance and the issues identified through that system level monitoring. So if you haven't done your reporting, the council's not going to cancel your registration if reporting is the only thing that you haven't done. For example, that's just a basic example to illustrate the proportionality of the risk response. But if you haven't reported and you've got a history of substantiated complaints and you're delivering and the council suspended your registration 12 months earlier, then potentially the council might be considering a sanction next time you present with non-compliances following a monitoring audit. Sometimes the regulatory response will just be an internal review process. So you may or may not be aware, fairly recently, probably about 18 months ago, we undertook a marketing review. So we had a look at your websites, and if there were any issues, we would have called you up and said, look, can you just update your website? This is a little bit out of sync with you're advertising something that you're not on scope to deliver anymore, and it's just been a reminder to keep your website up to date. So that was as an outcome of some internal review process, and we just quietly contacted you, and you were able to address those issues through that mechanism. But if you didn't address those issues in a timely manner, then in some cases those issues escalated to the Training Accreditation Council, where they would consider your registration. So the internal review process is really provides you, they're low-level issues, and they're often issues that we recognise providers can fix pretty quickly, and if they do, then it really has no impact on you as a provider. It's just us keeping a little watch and just phoning you and just letting you know quietly that something needs fixing. Audit, of course, and we've got a few audit strategies. Obviously, a comprehensive site audit, sometimes a desk audit. Some of you might be familiar with our compliance monitoring audit. That's the audit where we apply, or I speak on behalf of the council, applies where there's consistent non-compliance and there's patterns of non-compliance. So if that's the case, and there's some criteria for that, if you're not familiar with that, the details are available on our website. If there are those consistent patterns of non-compliance, then the next audit the council requires to be undertaken at your registration, then it's an audit that you pay for. Okay, so that's a regulatory response tool available to the council, same as the national regulator. So some audits you'll find you'll have to pay for in those areas of higher level non-compliance, or where there's consistent levels of non-compliance. And of course, education, as I've mentioned before, as a legitimate response to helping support you really in your compliance practices as well. So we offer quite a range of opportunities there. So all in all, the lower the risk, the lesser the regulatory response. The higher the risk, the more severe the regulatory response. And I think that goes without saying, and it's pretty obvious to most people. So if you're an RTO that has fairly high levels of non-compliance and there appears to be some pattern, then you can expect the council to direct a compliance monitoring audit, which is an audit that you pay for. So that's not going to be any surprise. And of course, like I said, the criteria is on the website. And you'll start to see, actually, as we've introduced this new risk approach, and we've started to see the change already. In the past, if you're a TAC regulated RTO, if you made an application to TAC, in the past, that transaction based approach to risk was that we would really only risk rate you at the point at which you're submitting an amendment application. So we'd assess the risk that was attached to the application itself and not really look at the risk that you presented as a whole RTO more broadly. So we risk assess the application and we would decide whether to audit or not audit that application. And that was really the way that we manage risk. Now risk is undertaken or assessed much more wholly. So when you next submit your renewal of registration application, or when you submit your next amendment application, you might see a different response to what you may have expected in the past. We've already seen a couple of RTOs go through their renewal of registration process with no audit. So when we sent those applications up to council for consideration, the staff in the office took a deep breath and thought, okay, here we go, brave new world. But there was just no way we could justify auditing those applications. Even if the council did decide to audit some of those renewal applications, you might see a less comprehensive audit. So you'll see a much more targeted audit. So rather than, like we may have done in the past for a renewal of registration audit everything across the scope of your operations, what we'll do in the future, if you're not getting through with no audit, we're just looking at a couple of different training packages. We're just looking at a few different areas rather than everything. So you'll really start to see those of you who are, in our eyes, lower risk, and you'll know if you're lower risk. If you don't have complaints, if you've got a good audit history, then you can expect a lower level of regulatory scrutiny by the council. Okay, so I think that's certainly a positive. And like I said, we've started to see a change in the council's approach. So they've put their money where their mouth is. They've published the risk framework. They've published the annual regulatory strategy. And as I said, we've started to see a shift in their approach. We've got applications for renewal that have gone through without audit. So it's starting to happen, and we've started to see it actually in action, which is a little bit nerve-wracking for some of the staff in the office, as I said, but I think it's good. Like I said, there's no way we could justify going to audit on a couple of those applications. So the annual regulatory strategy, what you will see there today, the current annual regulatory strategy, which really only has another 4 weeks or so, as far as its relevancy goes. But just to give you a taste of what to expect for the next one, the 17-18 regulatory strategy. So some of these things are givens, okay? The VET regulator standards say that upon initial registration, so for a new RTO, the regulator needs to come out and audit you within 24 months of your initial registration. So that's mandated. That's not a choice that we have, sorry, I hit the mic. That's not a choice that we have as a VET regulator. It's in the VET regulator standards that we must come and do that audit within 24 months. That post-initial audit is what it's called, is an audit across the operations of your organisation. It's the first time often, unless you've had some other monitoring audit since your initial registration, the post-initial audit is often the first time that we actually see the deployment of your systems. All the stuff you said you were going to do at your initial registration, at the post-initial audit, we actually want to see that you're actually doing it, and we want to see how you're doing it in action. Compliance monitoring audits I've already talked about, so it lets you know that the council does have a policy of applying compliance monitoring audits in areas of higher levels of non-compliance and where there are patterns of non-compliance. Strategic industry audits, so that's, like I said, when industry comes to us and says there's a really serious issue here, high risk work licence being an example, high risk to safety of individuals, high risk on a whole lot of levels, where the council really couldn't avoid going forward with an approach. We look at the data, we take a sampling approach to our RTOs, and we undertake that strategy. SIAs are extremely highly resourced, so they often, or up until now, they always have a industry reference group. So the audit strategy is informed by key industry players as part of that process. And we also, if you're aware of our strategic industry audits, we also publish a final report. So the council's very open in its in publishing its findings and the recommendations from that audit strategy. And often strategic industry audits are about a partnership with industry and industry stakeholders. So undertaking TAC audits is only one part of the solution. So we really need industry to do its bit, and it's what you'll often see in the recommendations of strategic industry audits, where we commit to working with other stakeholders to address the issue or the issues that we've found. We can't fix all of industry's problems. We can't fix wages. We can't fix safety at the workplace. But we can certainly look at compliance against the standards for RTOs and the requirements set out in the training packages. That's our mandate. So we'll let industry know what we found there. And of course, the compliance recognition program. So on the positive, if you're a good performer, good compliance history, there's a program set out there for you to think about, but it is by invitation from the council for that one. So you don't automatically qualify and therefore automatically go into the program. We look at your eligibility into the program, and the council will write to you. So that's been the focus of the provider risk issues in the annual regulatory strategy. The focus in the strategy for the monitoring of systemic risk. Currently, in some of these things you'll actually probably see again for the 17-18 annual regulatory strategy. As I've already mentioned, and funnily enough, some of these things have had a mention this morning, but amount of training. It's fairly new in the standards. Continues to be an area that is mixed levels of understanding and application across RTOs. So the amount of training, not to be confused with volume of learning, so the amount of training, and we do run some PD in this space, but the amount of training. So looking at your learner cohort, looking at those individuals and coming up with a program that actually meets the needs of that particular learner or that learner cohort in terms of the amount of training that you provide. And it is a good way, as the panel said this morning, a good way of really reflecting on your learner needs and deciding how much time is appropriate for this person to get through all of the training and assessment that's required to become competent. Assessment, again, continues to be an area of higher levels of non-compliance. But having said that, it's also an area that's at the core of our training and assessment practices out in RTOs. So of course it goes without saying assessment is going to be a key focus for the Council and will more than likely continue to be. That's not going to go away. The Cert 3 individual support was an area that we focused on, so we said every new application for the Cert 3 individual support would see a site audit. So you're very clear if you're going to apply for the Cert 3 individual support, that's going to be an application that's going to be audited. So those of you who are familiar with that area, that came about where 3 different streams, disability, health and community care, and one other, aged care, thank you, were collapsed into one qualification. So we felt the need to keep a close eye on that. And also for those of you who are aware, a few years ago we also undertook a strategic industry audit in the aged care area. So it just continues to be an area that we keep monitoring for different reasons. Obviously, sometimes out of a strategic industry audit, there's a recommendation to undertake some ongoing monitoring of those providers where there were higher levels of non-compliance. So a lot of those providers saw, in the sample, a follow-up monitoring audit sometime down the track, 6 months, 12 months down the track. So the annual regulatory strategy picked that up as well. And the Council also wanted to continue that monitoring whereby if you applied for delivery of some of those licensed 2 units that link to high-risk work licences, you also could expect to see an audit linked to that application. Of course, qualifications from the Training and Education training package continues to be a focus for the Council and the Australian Skills Quality Authority, obviously being the key qualification that underpins our sector for our VET professionals. We're not going to shy away from that. So if you're not already aware, there are specific evidence requirements published on our website. So if you're looking to apply for the 16 version, you'll be aware of those application requirements. So as the old one, I think the transition for that ends coming up in October, early October. We may start to see some more applications. It's been very quiet. Both regulators haven't approved very many applications. I think last count there were 6 to 8 providers across the country approved for the 16 version of TAE. So that's an area that's likely to continue on our 17-18 annual regulatory strategy. Third-party arrangements, as I said, has been a focus, and we're not sure whether will continue to be a focus, but at this point is a focus. It's particularly high risk when you outsource, as you can understand when you outsource a service, particularly when it comes to delivery and assessment, that would be an area that we'd like to focus on. And of course you would want to ensure, you're responsible for that quality assurance for that delivery of that service away from your central site. Complaints and marketing practices. Marketing practices is an interesting one. That's where the highest levels of complaints inquiries actually centre around is marketing practices. So your competitor down the road is calling us up and saying, so-and-so's advertising this and they shouldn't be, or they're advertising a really short course, how can they be doing that? Rah, rah, rah. So it goes on and on and on. So please make sure your websites are up to date. It's actually a serious breach of the standards, particularly in the area where you might be advertising for a particular training product that's not on your scope. It's a breach of the legislation and it can result in a heavy penalty. So for those of you who have people who are looking after your websites, make sure the compliance people, the people that are managing your scope and your website people are talking to one another. It's really important that what you're promoting through your website is up to date and current. And we've seen instances where they're not result in audits, and also any training products where you're not the RTO but you're outsourcing and there's a partnership arrangement with another provider, that you make it very, very clear on your website that that's what you're doing. It's an area that we get a lot of complaints around as well. So I really encourage you to keep that information up to date. The education program. TAC has really made a strong commitment to its education program the last 12 months, and we've really ramped up what we do in that space and what we offer. And we really do, we've had a really great response to it. So those of you who've come to some of our workshops, we kicked off late last year with a full day workshop covering three pretty key topics. This year we've gone with half days covering specific topics. So rather than just the information about information about amount of training or information about assessment, we're just taking it that one step further and providing you with some activities that help support your understanding and your capacity or your capability around understanding how to implement those requirements within the standards. So it's a big step for the council in the past, particularly pre-standards for RTOs and pre the current VET regulator standards. It was really not a space that the council or any VET regulator really wanted to go into. They saw it as a conflict of interest. You can't have the regulator providing other than information, taking that information the next step with providers to help support them and be more a partner in helping to improve compliance practices. So the new VET regulator standards and the requirements in there, and a real shift for what, I suppose, more modern approaches to regulation, not just in VET but other regulation spaces as well. It was really acknowledged that education was really a space that we needed to move into. So they agreed to that, and we've gone ahead with that. We will have some of you have already been to our sessions. Our experts, being our auditors, actually deliver and run those sessions with support from the TAC Secretariat. So you're really hearing from experts themselves and the people that are out auditing this stuff. So they've been really, really well received so far. Our next sessions are coming up in July. So we're really looking at helping you with the doing part of addressing the standards, as I've got there up on the slide. So some really great feedback so far from providers. Webinars and workshops. So webinars is a great way to get to more providers or interested parties, people who are looking at wanting to become RTOs or wanting to accredit a course. They can join up one of our webinars, which have been very, very popular. So those ones are purely webinars. Many of them are free. The only ones we charge for are when we use the Department of Training Workforce Development's platform, and they do come at a cost. So we have a great partnership with DTWD, but all the others are free. Workshops that we've run this year and what we've got coming up. Our next one's halfway down the TAC Education workshops. The next ones will be around assessment and assessment validation, okay, which I think people will have a... So again, what the data is telling us, these are the areas that we have decided we need to focus our education programs or education workshops on. Probably stating the obvious, why wouldn't we not take that approach? So in April, some of you may have been there, vocational competency and currency, which went really well. July will be assessment and assessment validation. So look out for those dates. We'll publish those dates probably 3 or 4 weeks out. They're looking like end of July. What we'll do is we'll run the same session 3 times in 1 week. So we did that in April, so it allowed people to attend a time convenient to them. So over a week, it could be a Monday, Wednesday or Friday morning, for example, but we haven't finalised that just yet. And it'll be a full morning with morning tea, and we'll let you go at lunchtime. October, we haven't finalised our topics for October, our topic for October just yet. And DTWD often invite us to their summer short professional development day in December, so no doubt we'll be there doing something, and it'll be a topic across the standards for RTOs somewhere, okay? So I really encourage you to look out for those. Our workshops, these workshops are all free of charge, so it's just your time, and they're also available online. Registrations are available for those as well, okay? So if you can't get them in a face-to-face capacity, then I welcome you to pursue the online registration version. Even if you're in the metro and you just can't get away, it's more convenient for you to sit in an office or sit at home and hook into a webinar, then I encourage you to do that too. As I said, we're currently planning our 17-18 annual regulatory strategy, and we've sought input from a range of stakeholders already. We've met with ACPET members, we've met with our industry training councils, we've actually already sent out a survey to numerous industry people around WA, through our service skills organisations as well, getting to local and national individuals or industry representatives to let us know what they think the issues are that the council should focus on. So as well as looking at the data that's telling us where the problem areas are, as I've been through for our 16-17 strategy, some of those things you might see a continuation on into 17-18, but you will start to see some new things be presented there. So what I wanted to do the last 10 minutes of today's session, I wanted to, and I think I've got somebody handing out some bits of paper for me, or a couple of people. I wanted to have the last 10 minutes where I could just have you think about the key issues that you feel are problematic for the sector. And I've got a small piece of paper. This is optional. You don't have to submit this, but if you do, I just ask as you leave today that you just leave your piece of paper at the chair just by the doors at the back. But I'd be really interested in hearing from you what you feel are some of the key issues facing the sector at the minute. So there's three areas. And I've got a piece of paper coming around which will be back to front. So three things I really would love for you to think about that are problematic within the sector. Those of you who are online, if you would like to email, next slide I'll have the TAC email address. So if you could make some notes now and email the TAC email address after today's session, that would be really appreciated too. So please do that if you have the time. Again, not mandatory, but I would really love if you could just spend a couple of minutes doing this. But on the piece of paper, you'll see there's a little bit of space. So top 3 general areas of concern regarding VET and the action the council could take to mitigate those concerns. It's really important that we have a sense from you, well, what's a likely regulatory response to those issues? Is it that severe or that widespread that might warrant a strategic industry audit? Or is it a series of monitoring audits? Or is it something that the council may want to monitor from an internal perspective? Or is it more education in a particular area? So top 3 general areas of concern. Is it assessment validation? Is it something specific against the link to the standards for RTOs that you think, oh, we just really need more clarity on this, there's just not enough good information. So anything specific to the standards might be an issue. And then the next thing is the top 3 quals or units of competency. So the top 3 training products that raise the most concern and reason for the concern that you have. So the top 3 training products that raise the most concern for you and the reason for that concern. So is it you've got a problem with a particular training product because it's mostly delivered in an online delivery mode? That's a real concern for you. And then on the flip side of that piece of paper, we've listed, and I'll have, for the online audience, I have one more slide so you can see all the responses and the numbers to choose. The areas that RTOs generally don't do well. So the piece of paper you have on the flip side is, I think, 16, about 16 general areas. And I only just want you to choose 3. The top 3 areas you feel RTOs generally don't do well. So I'll just leave this slide just for a couple of minutes for the online audience because they don't have the benefit of the sheet of paper in front of them. So the top 3 general areas of concern and the action the council could take to mitigate that concern and the top 3 quals or units of competency that raise the most concern for you as a training provider, and the reason for that concern. So for the online audience, I'll just flick to the next slide so you can see the full number of issues that we've listed for areas that you feel RTOs don't do well. So I'm just asking you to pick 3 numbers. You don't have to write out, for the online audience, you don't have to write out your top 3 in full. If you just make a note of the numbers. Just as people are still writing, we've just got 5 minutes left for the session, and I'd really love to open up for discussion or any comments that people have or any questions people have about the Council's risk framework and its annual regulatory strategy or its general risk approach. Just while people are still writing, we've got a few minutes. I know sometimes people are just really itching to share their ideas about what they feel are some of the biggest risks to the sector, areas the Council might want to focus on, or any other general comments that you have.
What's your approach when it comes to keeping all the sort of standards across auditing the same? So if they're walking into and auditing a particular qualification, we're not sitting in a situation where we're compliant on one situation, we're taking that across to another qualification, and we're hitting problems there.
Yeah, a really great question, and we get it a lot. It's the ever eternal, I think, question and issue for us as regulators and RTOs, and we don't shy away from those questions. Look, a few things. We do a lot of moderation with our auditors. So as recently as last Friday, we get them together 4 times a year for a full day where we do a lot of moderation with them. We pull out audits of the most recent last quarter, and we ask them to work through, and we discuss, and we workshop, and we moderate those issues. We black out the outcomes of that audit and just see when they're all in the room together, what outcomes that they achieve through that process. We talk through a lot of issues that are coming up across RTOs, questions that they're getting at audit, and we talk through them a lot. We get agreement, we have a moderation register, all those sorts of things. So moderation, as you would probably do within your organisations, how do you ensure people are consistent in their approach? We do the same thing with our auditor. In our auditor group. We also, it's very strong, our auditors have a very strong collegial network, so they email one another, including the Secretariat, on the issues that are coming up. They'll broadcast questions or issues or scenarios that they're seeing at audit, and getting a sense from the other auditors where they might, the approach that they might take as well. In an audit situation, I've been at many audits as an observer. Every audit is different. I think the trainer of the year on the panel said this, that sometimes there's documents that you prepare for compliance and documents that are based on what you do over here. We would rather you didn't prepare documentation just for compliance. Really. I mean, what's the point? And it's such a waste of time and resources. Just do what you think is a good thing to do in your day-to-day practice as an RTO. And the compliance will come from that. You shouldn't be preparing compliance documentation for the sake of compliance. That's really not what we're encouraging at all. So, what's good business practice? All the good things that make up or that you build on that contribute to running a good business. Good compliance is going to come from that. It's not going to come from where people become unstuck is where they've developed these complicated compliance documentation that nobody really understands how they apply in practice. That doesn't work. I've been in situations where the simplest systems, people haven't got the fancy, policy documents and an online system where everybody knows. It's the conversation backed up by good evidence about what you do on a daily basis that actually is the stuff that gets through. So not an easy answer to question to answer, but we do a lot of moderation. We do ask a lot of questions, and we do have a lot of discussion with auditors. But every situation, every context is different. So make sure your trainers assessors are all familiar with your systems and how they apply in their general areas. Look, our time has come to the end. I'm more than happy to stay. I have time to stay today, so I'm happy to take questions one-on-one with you about your RTO. If I can't answer them here today, then I'll refer you back to the office, but I'm more than happy to stay. But thank you very much for your attention. Thank you to the online audience and your patience, and have a great afternoon.